A warm welcome to the first of the FUBiS online summer school lectures. My name is Lauren van Vuuren and I'm going to be giving a lecture today on a short section of my broader course that I teach for FUBiS summer school. The course is called Berlin, 20th Century Berlin, People, Places, Words. And this course is for me really a labor of love. Now, I came to Berlin in 2012 on a research fellowship from South Africa, from the University of Cape Town. And I was just meant to come and do some research and go home, and I was bitten by the bug, the Berlin bug. It is a city that can truly generate a kind of obsessive devotion amongst its fans, and I very quickly found myself reordering my entire life, moving here, and I'm now a writer and historian based in the city. And so the opportunity to teach this course on 20th century Berlin history for the FUBiS summer school is really a kind of labor of love, a merging of my passion for the stories of the city with an urgent need to understand how things happened here. Berlin was, in the 20th century, really at numerous points the epicenter of world history. And at other times it was a ruminating backwater, and that's also very interesting. And this is all of these different aspects are what I cover in my 20th century history course. But I use a very particular strategy in examining Berlin's 20th century history. I'm interested in biographies. I'm interested in people who witnessed extraordinary or important moments in the city's history and wrote about it, or instigated change, or reflected upon it, produced art about it. And these sort of cultural artifacts are a way offer us a way of exploring via sometimes quite interesting backways the process of historical change during one of the most tumultuous centuries in human history. Today, I'm going to be giving you a taster of the first section of my course, which looks at Weimar Berlin. You'll see on the slide, Weimar Berlin is the name Weimar. The name Weimar refers to the Weimar Republic, which existed more or less from 1918 to 1933. And the great tragedy of the history of this republic, this German republic, was that it was sandwiched between two authoritarian regimes, one less authoritarian than the other. The one is the Imperial Germany, so Imperial Germany under the King. And this was the Germany that marched so confidently into World War I and came out on the other side shattered and destroyed. And as a result of the catastrophe of World War I, Germany's king, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was required to abdicate. That was the end of Imperial Germany, and now a period of very brief democratic rule begins. A fledgling, vulnerable regime called the Weimar Republic that comes into power at a time when there is such societal breakdown and such destruction has occurred, and such economic trouble is being experienced, vast impoverishment of people, that the entire project is threatened from the beginning. All of the best things about Weimar, the fact that it was more progressive, more democratic, more open than anything that had come before in Germany, all of this was threatened by the fundamental societal upheaval and destruction that had prefigured it, and which would later be bookended. It would bookend it with the rise of the Nazi regime. So you have this very short period of a democratic republic run more or less by social democrats, okay? But everything about Weimar is fragile. The economic power of Germany, its slow recovery and then collapse again, is fragile. The political alliances that allow for a democracy to operate in Germany, for example, between social democrats and more radical revolutionaries or Bolsheviks, or let's say hardcore communists, all of these alliances are fragile. And in the background, that fragility boils away and boils away. And in the end, Weimar is the victim of its own inherent internal pressure points that are never resolved. They're simply never resolved. So how do we know about Weimar? So you might know, some of you might be familiar with Weimar Berlin because you will have watched the Babylon Berlin series on Netflix, which is quite a rare thing, an actual international television hit for Germany. Germany has not had many of these. So this has been very popular, especially in the United States, in the UK, and some of you will be familiar with this kind of glitzy cabaret world, heavy, dark criminal elements, sort of all the fissures in the society, all existing inside this series. Those of you who are movie buffs, I'm thinking about your ages on average, you probably wouldn't have seen it yourselves in the cinema, but your parents will know it, and certainly you might have a sense of it because it's one of the great iconic films of the 1970s, which is Cabaret, with Liza Minnelli playing a prostitute in Berlin. And this is based on, or a cabaret dancer, and this is based on the work of Christopher Isherwood. And Christopher Isherwood, of course, wrote Goodbye to Berlin, which was his great homage to the decadence and the fermentation and the excitement of that cabaret scene in Berlin in the 1920s, which is, of course, then marched over by the jackboots of the Nazis. And so these are very famous examples of sort of recordings or references back to Weimar Berlin. So when we think about these kinds of cultural productions, what you tend to have, you probably have some sense that this was all about sleaze and cultural permissiveness and artistic experimentation. And certainly this period saw, especially in Berlin, and this is a very important point, Berlin was the epicenter of this, but especially in Berlin you have this extraordinary flowering of art, and a kind of optimistic experimental work, reworking with music, with theatre, with novel writing. Everything is under construction, being challenged, being rewritten. So here's a list of some of the names you would probably associate with this period if you know a little bit about it. The playwright Brecht, the composer Schöneberg, Thomas Mann, the writer, Gropius, the famous architect. All of these are names associated with this period. You might also know of Marlene Dietrich. Now, she is somebody who comes on the scene a little bit later, towards the end of the 1920s, but she was famously androgynous, walking around in drag, dressed as a man, in a very kind of open and relaxed way, at a time when that would have been regarded as pretty sensational and boundary pushing. She was her own woman. She played the part she wanted to play. She was essentially a kind of filmic goddess, and she represented the experimental wildness of that period in many people's eyes. And she's one of the people who chose to leave. She herself wasn't Jewish, but she feared being co-opted into the Nazi regime. The Nazis used film very powerfully for their propaganda efforts, and she wasn't interested in being co-opted into that. So she went to the bright lights of the United States and Hollywood, where she had a substantial career. So these are just some of the kind of references that you might recognize, names, people, experiences, books, films, etc. And it's very easy to just sort of drop the line golden 20s and then move on. But the story of Weimar is much more complicated and much more tragic than that. And what I would like to do in this seminar, which is what I do to a little bit of a greater length in the course, is to take you beyond the glamorous stage, the cabarets, etc., to the really grim world that characterized Weimar, the Weimar period, especially here in Berlin. Partly the reason we are so well versed with the work of the artists and the thinkers who were at the center of this flowering of art and culture is because they were all later very high-profile exiles. And this is a very interesting thing. I mean, you can only in history know what happened through the witnesses of those who were there. And if there was ever a period where the most extraordinary people were forced into exile and could therefore in retrospect bear witness to the period, it is Weimar. So you see this extraordinary emphasis that this exodus of artists, writers, thinkers, scientists mainly from 1933 onwards, but of course there were many people who saw the writing on the wall before and got out. And one of the most well-known historians of this period in the English-speaking world, a guy called the historian Peter Gay, he writes that this exodus, these exiles, in other words, people who were in the heart of the Weimar scene in Berlin, but then were forced to leave because of the threat of the Nazis, these people, and I quote, constituted the greatest collection of transplanted intellect, talent, and scholarship the world has ever seen. Now, Peter Gay is writing this in the 1960s. It might be seen as a little hyperbolic, but he's making a very, very good point. He's making the point that the sheer extraordinary quality of the people who escaped Weimar led to the formation of a kind of fantasy of what this time was. Right, so the witnesses who bore witness to this period were extraordinary people, and they created cultural, manifest, tangible cultural products, films, books, paintings, theatre, etc., that was then exported by their exile, but also by the exporting of their products, the things they made, which gives us a very, very powerful snapshot of one part of Weimar and Weimar Berlin. But what about behind the scenes? What about the societal upheaval that is consistently going on throughout the short period of the Weimar regime, from 1918 to 1933? How did ordinary people experience that period that ultimately culminated in Nazism? And in order for us to understand that, we need to go back to the end of World War I. Now, the important thing to understand about the end of World War I is it wasn't just about the devastation of the old order of Europe, which of course it was, but it was also about a sudden questioning of all of the things that had been taken for granted when the war broke out. You know, militaristic, imperial, authoritarian Germany, imperial Germany that marched into World War I comes out broken, and that cultural, that societal cohesion is destroyed. The kind of agreement that people had about what was right and what was wrong and what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable, this was destroyed. And part of this relates to the nature of World War I. And this is a very important point. I'm going to make it briefly, possibly too simplistically, but historians generally recognize the significance of World War I as the first great industrial war. And what that means is that throughout the 19th century, as industrialization develops, grandly enriches Europe, makes the world a smaller, more controllable place, there is an idea that accompanies that technology will lead to a kind of perfected human society. That all of these developments in technology and medicine and etc. is going to mean in the end a kind of utopian world free of war and sickness and all the things that plague us as human beings. And the optimism of that is also aided and assisted by the fact that Europe experiences in the second half of the 19th century a period of relative peace between the great powers. So when all this technology and all of this development suddenly comes into the context, or suddenly takes the form of World War I, it is a devastating scene. In other words, the grand machines that have been created, that have so transformed society, are now the same machines that are not perfecting the human race, but are utterly destroying the human race. World War I was a grinding hellhole. The Western Front showed how very little a human body, no matter how brave, educated, kind, good you might be, machine guns, shells, gas, tanks, bombs dropped from the air, these things destroyed humans. And the scale and the carnage of World War I was devastating for all the powers. So nobody comes out of World War I with the same faith in the future and with the same faith in the old order as they do going into World War I. And in Germany, that manifests in the abdication of the king in 1918. And then remember, further east, you have the Bolshevik Revolution, which basically means that as a result, again, of the upheaval of World War I, one of the grand old powers of Europe sees itself completely transformed by a communist revolution and now run by Bolsheviks along the lines of Marxist-Leninism. This is shattering for the old order. All the old certainties are gone. And this is the important thing to understand about the context for Weimar at the end of World War I. So many millions of Germans who witness the Bolshevik Revolution, who are starving at the end of World War I, find hope in this idea that there can be some justice for ordinary people. Because what's happened in Germany, and again, I'm running quite quickly through something which is obviously a very dense topic, but I'm just trying to set the scene. Simply put, Germany does not lose the war militarily, but loses the war because of the Allied blockade that stops food coming into the country, and the grinding down of the isolationist strategies of the Allies. Which means that on the battlefield the Germans are still strong, but the society back home can no longer bear the burden of hunger and sacrifice. And as a result there is an internal collapse, and this leads to the end of World War I. And remember, this gives the Nazis in particular later on a great weapon, because Hitler can always say it wasn't Germany that lost on the battlefield, we were militarily superior, but we were stabbed in the back by the politicians and the people back home who pulled the country down. And we're going to discuss later who the Nazis thought were the bad guys in that scenario, the so-called stab in the back. So the point is, Berlin and Germany and Berlin, and let's focus now, let's bring our focus closer to home, to Germany and to Berlin. When the war ends, it is in a state of collapse, and a series of worker uprisings leads to the fundamental destabilizing of the state, and the king abdicates. And what replaces the king is, as I said earlier, a social democracy, but it is very, very fragile, because Berlin itself is now at the center of a series of convulsive uprisings, of which the abdication of the king is only the first one. I'm going to turn now briefly to a wonderful description. Walter Gropius, who was one of the famous architects of the 1920s, and the founder of Bauhaus, which many of you will know, he provides us with a wonderful glimpse of revolutionary Berlin in 1918. He describes coming through Berlin just as the revolution against the king is breaking out, and seeing the crowds assault officers. Now, when I say officers, I mean officers in the army. And for him, this is extremely important, because the image of the military man, and especially in Berlin had always long been associated with militarism. The army was very present in the history of Berlin, and soldiers and officers were a very important part of the fabric of the city. And to see those omniscient symbols of Imperial and Prussian Germany just being shouted at, attacked, kicked at, spat at by the mob on the street. And he says, and the quote is wonderful, listen carefully, he says, "This is more than a lost war." So he looks at these officers being kicked around and he goes, this is more than a lost war. A world has come to an end. We must seek a radical solution to our problems. And this is exactly what the artists of the 1920s were doing. They were attempting to build inside the vacuum of the nothingness created by the collapse of the old order after World War I. They were attempting to essentially build a new world from that old. Right, let us plunge into the heart of revolutionary Berlin in 1918 and 1919. Now, Weimar Berlin is very well known as a place that attracts a great number of artists and thinkers and writers. But it didn't originate in Weimar. In the period running up to the end of imperial rule in Germany, there is an influx of thinkers and writers who are interested in the idea of the German working class as the place or the site of a potential and successful world communist revolution. Marx himself predicts that Germany will be the place where the industrial working class will be sophisticated enough to rise up and achieve revolution. And so a number of thinkers are attracted to Berlin in the period after the turn of the century, in those 14 years before World War I breaks out, to observe and be part of the ferment of this revolutionary potential in Berlin. And one of the people who comes to Berlin for this reason is our Zeitzeug, our witness to the times today, Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg's life and death is incredibly emblematic and evocative as a kind of story about the tragedy and the complexity of this period of 1918 and 1919, and of the trauma that birthed the Weimar Republic. Now, we need a little bit of background history here. Of all the European capitals, Berlin was the most excited and interested in the Bolshevik Revolution that began in 1917 in the Soviet Union. The factory owners, the middle classes, the old elite, the aristocracy were very nervous when they looked east and saw what they perceived as anarchy of the Bolshevik Revolution. But the industrial working class of Berlin perceives potential, sees a blueprint for a way forward. And in order to understand this, we need to take one of those little detours that could even be another lecture in and of itself, but we're going to move through it a little bit quickly. In the second half of the 19th century, Berlin becomes one of the great industrial heartlands of Europe. And as industrialization renders useless many of the old occupations, people start, forced out of their livelihoods, come towards and into Berlin en masse. And there they become part of an urban proletariat that powers the industry, the engines of industry, which makes Berlin and Germany very rich in the second half of the 20th century, but at terrible cost to the ordinary people. So by the 1860s and 70s, workers in Berlin are being packed into tight tenements, unsanitary, cold, hot, dark, damp, packed together. The average lifespan, for example, of a young woman working in a factory in the 1890s was 28 years, just to give you a sense of the disease and the limited life expectancy and the sheer degradation of life as a person who was working in the factories of Berlin in the second half of the 19th century. The irony for the establishment is that being packed together so tightly in such appalling conditions led to a very, very intense and sophisticated class consciousness. And this class consciousness was attractive to Marx. It was also attractive to all the thinkers and writers who believed that it would be here that the revolution would be achieved. So by the time you get to 1914, Berlin has a really sophisticated and networked radical worker class. Now, the outbreak of the war sees a temporary abdication of these ideas. Most people get swept up in war fervor and fever, excitement about conflict. Germany, like all of the European powers, marches triumphantly into the war. And for a little while, these class loyalties dissolve in favor of patriotism. But as the war grinds on and the horrors of industrial warfare reveal themselves, so do those class loyalties begin to return, especially as, of course, it is the poor who suffer the worst, or suffer the most, as World War I grinds on. So for the working class in Germany and in Berlin, the Bolshevik Revolution it's a blueprint, it's potential, it's exactly what could be achieved. A small, dedicated group of radical revolutionaries stepping up and transforming one of the grand old powers of Europe. By 1919, Lenin actively attempting to sow the seeds of revolution in Berlin and in Germany. He sends 5 million marks from Moscow, 300 operatives who arrive in Berlin disguised as temporary embassy staff, and their purpose is to align themselves with the most radical elements of the German left. And this comes to this brings us to our interesting moment of the divisions. So there wasn't just one left, there was a range of positions that people held on the left. And again, this is a very complicated topic, but for the sake of our story, you had the Social Democrats who believed in incremental change backed by democratic elections so that society can be improved for working people slowly over time. And then you had the radical revolutionaries on the far left. They didn't want anything to do with slow change over time. They wanted revolution. Revolution now, revolution for always, and the complete upturning of society. And so Lenin's operatives do not align with the Social Democrats. They're far too soft as far as these guys are concerned. They're too soft. This is not interesting. The people to be aligned with in Berlin are the radicals on the very far left. And here we meet Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, who are the leaders of a splinter group within the Social Democrats. And the Social Democrats would soon be running Weimar Germany. These operatives from the Soviet Union, from Moscow, align with the splinter group with Karl Liebknecht, and Rosa Luxemburg. And now we must ask ourselves, who is this tiny woman? Because she was legendarily small. She was often seen at marches holding a parasol. Very, very, very bourgeois. Large hats, incendiarily good as a speaker, a great orator. And somebody who believed in the power of the pen, who wrote passionately, intensely and committedly for all of her life. So Rosa Luxemburg was a Polish Jew born on the 5th of March, 1871, to a progressive family in Poland. She spoke fluent German, Polish and Russian, and she, at a very young age, got her PhD on the industrial development of Poland. She was a doctor of law. And now she marries so that she can move to Berlin, to be at the center of the party struggle. She is an uncompromising Marxist-Leninist. In other words, for Rosa Luxemburg, only a revolution can achieve the liberation of minorities and the industrial working class. There's nothing in between. There's no second route or easier or more or compromised way of doing it. It's revolution or nothing. She actually deeply disliked Berlin. She disliked the pre-war Berlin, the stifling conservatism, the militarism, the machismo of men in the city. But she recognized the revolutionary potential of the industrial working class in the city. She was a brilliant orator, as I've already said. She founded the communist daily, the Rote Fahne. And she had a great passion for revolutionary theory, and she was in correspondence with some of the leading communist visionaries of the time. She spent most of World War I in prison. She was jailed for sedition, mainly to get her away from possibly demoralizing the workforce with her communist ideas. She uses the time in jail productively, though. She basically writes passionately, and her writing is brought out of the jail by a colleague of hers. And at the end of towards the end of World War I, she's released from jail, and she steps now into the tumult, the intense tumult of Berlin at the end of World War I. And it is a scene of note. In January of 1918, massive industrial action is declared in Germany. 500,000 metal and ammunition workers go on strike in Berlin. This is January of 1918. The war will end in November of 1918. But already in January of 1918, there are red flags flying all over Berlin. At the same time as you have this mass action in Germany, on the home front there is increasing demoralization. People are starving at home. They can no longer tolerate sacrificing their livelihoods and their lives for the war effort on the front. The war effort on the front line, whilst not militarily failed yet, and this is a very important point which the Nazis will go on and on and on about later on, that Germany was not defeated in war, in military battle, but by betrayal on the home front. What that betrayal really was people desperate and hungry and no longer able to carry the burden of the war effort. And as a result of this, there is a major uprising on the 4th of November. And this is important. This is important because what happens on the 4th of November is that a group of sailors mutiny in Kiel. And this is significant. So on the one hand, you've got mass industrial action in Berlin. A few months earlier, rumbling throughout the country, increasingly starved and demoralized population, civilian population. And then suddenly the Navy, the sailors, refused to carry out instructions that would have led to further senseless killing just a few days before the end of World War I. So what you see here, why these are all so significant, is you have a fundamental demoralization and deconstruction, as such, of all of the traditional bastions of authority that were unquestioned. And on the 9th of November, you have the abdication of the king. So you very quickly, the power blocks of the country begin to fall in this final catastrophic period. When the king abdicates on the 9th of November, 1918, the Social Democrats who take power, who institute a democratic parliamentary republic, they choose not to institute Soviet-style committees that would suspend democracy. And this is very important. The people who take over after the king abdicates and flees Berlin choose to opt for a democracy and a republic, which would later become the Weimar Republic. And this brings us back to Rosa Luxemburg. And in the scene of carnage and upheaval, we come to the final days of her life, because she represented the extreme left who did not, as I've said repeatedly in this lecture, who did not want to see a democratic transition, who did not want to see a slow democratic process ensuing after the abdication of the king, who wanted society rebuilt from scratch along the lines of a Soviet model. And the point about this period of revolutionary turmoil in Berlin, is that it's not like there is suddenly peace. The upheavals of the November Revolution, the end of World War I, the sheer scale of the carnage of the war leads to enduring instability. And in Berlin on the 5th of January 1919, Rosa Luxemburg and her colleague Karl Liebknecht decide that it is now time to instigate a final push for a proper revolution in Germany. For Liebknecht and Luxemburg, this first revolution of November was just the opening salvos of the real revolution which had to come, and which had to be the overthrowing and the undermining of the provisional government of Ebert, and of course to disrupt elections, because the very important thing to understand is this radical and extreme left doesn't have a huge support base. Should there be elections, the splinter group under Luxemburg and Liebknecht would probably not have won. So the idea was to facilitate, to instigate enough societal chaos that they could slip in via the back door, that they could take control from behind the scenes. And this is the point of the Spartacus uprising. And again, we have no time to go into depth about what happened that day. There is amazing material online on the internet. You can also see videos on YouTube which shows this attempt by a small splinter group to nail the final, to hammer the final nail into the coffin of democracy in Germany and the Social Democrats, and it fails. It completely fails. And the most important reason why the Spartacus uprising on the 5th of January 1919 fails is because the government under Ebert uses right-wing militias, returning soldiers from the front line of World War I, to crush the uprising. And I want you to, I've said to you that the life and death of Rosa Luxemburg is reflective of the inherent tensions and tragedies of Weimar. And here we come to the very point. In order to maintain the stability of a fledgling new democracy in the shadow of the catastrophe of World War I and the abdication of the king, the social disruption, the political disruption, Ebert and the SPD, the Social Democrats, they make a pact with the devil. I'm using emotive language on purpose because the militias that carried out the crushing of the Spartacus uprising were the same, or the precursors to what would later be the SA and the SS, but particularly the SA, the Sturmabteilung. So those, the militia that really ran the street fighting aspect of the Nazis' climb to power. So in other words, the Social Democratic government uses a right-wing militia to crush its own, because even though Luxemburg and Liebknecht were attempting to overthrow the provisional government of Ebert, they were still on their side of the political spectrum. They were just far more to the left. And I know this is confusing. I know it seems like an avalanche of conflicting ideas, but that's good, because that's exactly what it was like then too. In the moment, these various ideologies were rushing to the center to try and maintain or attain power. And in the process, all kinds of compromises and dirty deals were done. Rosa Luxemburg would later be murdered by the Freikorps, the militias. And I'm going to get to her death in a little bit. But that death, and this is again why Rosa Luxemburg is such an important figure, her death was symbolic of what would happen throughout the period of Weimar, which would be this unholy alliance between a nervous center-left government wishing to maintain law and order, who uses the military muscle, the might of right-wing militias that end up crushing any kind of left-wing agitation. So Rosa Luxemburg's death is tragic in and of its own right, but it was also highly symbolic of the unholy alliances that would continue to be contradictory and destabilizing within Weimar. So the Spartacus revolution is not the most exciting. It was quite a flop by all accounts. It caused not much of a ripple, but the idea of it was powerful. For the rest of the Weimar period, fear of a radical left insurgency, uprising, a successful Bolshevik revolution, kept the government in alignment and in cahoots with right-wing militias who would also help bring in the Nazis, or bring the Nazis to power. So there is a great symbolic resonance to the tragic end to Rosa Luxemburg's life. And I might add that over the days around the 5th of January, Luxemburg was very clear that this had been the wrong decision. The idea of instigating an attempt or instigating a revolution, she recognized very quickly it was the wrong time, the wrong moment. She even tried to pull back, but Karl Liebknecht was pushing and pushing, with a lot of instigation from Moscow, of course. In the end, Luxemburg was arrested along with Karl Liebknecht for her part in the failed Spartacus uprising. And she was then killed extrajudicially. In other words, she was executed. There was no law court, there was no due process. She was simply taken out by militiamen, beaten, shot, and her body was dumped in the Landwehr Canal, in the Tiergarten. And the body sunk under the ice, and the ice froze over, and her body only rose up again in the spring. And for me, the image of this small woman brutally beaten and shot and then dumped in a canal seems like not only a tragic end for her life, for her meaningful life, but also a significant symbol of what would come in Weimar over the next years, and what would then culminate in the institutionalized violence of the Nazi regime. And I'm going to leave the Rosa Luxemburg section now with a quote from Amos Elon's beautiful book, The Pity of It All, which is a book about the relationship between Jewish Germans and Germans. And he quotes Luxemburg writing from prison. This is when she was still jailed during World War I. She writes to her friend, "What do you want with these special Jewish pains? I feel as close to the wretched victims of the rubber plantations in Putumayo and the blacks of Africa with whose bodies the Europeans play ball. I have no special corner in my heart for the ghetto. I am at home in the entire world, where there are clouds and birds and human tears." And Elon goes on to say, in the eyes of her murderers, she embodied the mythical threat of what was called Jewish Bolshevism. And this is something that becomes very, very significant as the years of Weimar pass. The kind of enemy within, the Jewish Bolshevist. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But as a woman, I'm quoting Elon again, as a woman, a socialist and a Polish Jew, she was a triple outsider. For this reason, historians have claimed that her murder was a foretaste of the horrors to come. We're now going to step into the second half of this lecture, the story of what happened in Weimar Berlin that then produced this golden age, the so-called golden age that I referenced at the start of the lecture. We've seen now through Rosa Luxemburg's story the catastrophic origins of Weimar. And it wasn't as if, as I said earlier, it wasn't as if there was suddenly peace and love on the streets of the city after the Spartacus uprising had been suppressed. In actual fact, to a large degree, the violence and the horror of World War I and the destabilization of society ricocheted into every aspect of daily life in Berlin in 1919, 1920, 1921 and 1922. There was a kind of a presence, a daily presence of violence on the streets of Berlin that would continue to destabilize the fabric of society. The violence became commonplace. It became entirely normal. Militia roamed the streets of Berlin looking for any signs of communist agitation. There were street fights, but also criminals flourished. One eyewitness at the time, George Gross, describes, "The times were out of joint. A flood of vice, pornography, and prostitution swept the country. Berlin was dark, cold, and full of rumors. The streets were wild ravines haunted by murderers and cocaine peddlers." And in order to understand this, you also need to understand that what has happened as a result, not just of the political upheaval after World War I, but what has also happened as a result of World War I is that the social fabric has been wiped out at a practical level. And what I mean by this, the savings of people have been wiped out. All of the values that people embraced to maintain a certain standard of living that was taken for granted before World War I, thrift, saving, a good work ethic, none of these things added up to anything anymore. You had a fortune one day and nothing the next. People were walking around with suitcases of money that was worthless. And as a result, you see a kind of movement in Berlin, a cultural turn, a societal turn away from middle class values, and crime simply becomes a completely ordinary thing in the running of the city. Moral relativism replaces the certainty of God and the values of a religious society or a society with religious values. And it is only in 1923 that the worst effects of this dark period of Berlin's history starts to right itself. And what happens then is that through a range of economic measures, including the introduction of the Rentenmark as a new currency, and the introduction of loans from the United States of America that stabilizes the German economy. Then you have, as a result of these developments, you have an improvement or a stabilization of the economy, which means that Berlin starts to recover from the worst of this ravening darkness that characterizes life after World War I and after the November Revolution and the failed Spartacus Revolution. There are mass building projects undertaken by the government, by the state, and censorship is relaxed. Now this is very important because this brings us to our next phase where we're going to look at this cultural burgeoning that happened under Weimar. The idea, the practical manifestation of reducing censorship, of allowing more to be said, has a very clear effect. It means that artists, writers, thinkers who would, under imperial rule, have been censored, kept on the sidelines, are now suddenly able to articulate their ideas in this new world, and these ideas are really radical. And this is one of those progressive steps undertaken by the Weimar government, which has such a palpable impact on daily life in Berlin. So Berlin by 1924-25 is a massive building site, and this is really, if you know Berlin and you love the city, you will smile at this because Berlin is always a massive building site. It is still a massive building site today. And one of my favorite quotes of all time about Berlin is from the French culture secretary Jacques Lang, who said in 2000, Paris is always Paris, but Berlin is never Berlin. And when you understand the quicksand upon which the city existed in the 20th century and into the 21st, you will smile at this quote. Because Berlin, another famous quote about Berlin is it's never in a state of being, but always in a state of becoming. And never more so than in this period of post-war rebuilding after World War I. But very importantly, the rebuilding is not happening in the image of the old order. It is a radical new world that is being built. And it is at this point, the merging, the falling of the old, encountering relaxed censorship laws, that you see an extraordinary pouring out of experimentation in the arts, in architecture. Everything in Berlin by 1925 is fast, it is wild, it is intense, it's bright lights. Berlin is the center of modernism. So, Berlin was, and this is a very interesting part of Berlin's history, when we locate ourselves in the city today, we experience the city as a great world city. But actually Berlin's long history was of relative insignificance, especially culturally. Berlin comes into its own at the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century, because it becomes the center of technological innovation, the fastness of modernity. The power of the Industrial Revolution is manifested in Berlin. And then after World War I, it attained something it had never attained before, despite the efforts over centuries of kings and city fathers attempting desperately to turn Berlin into a culturally significant city. For a very long time it was just a sandy city out on the Brandenburg Plains, and most of the important cultural life of Europe happened in places like Paris and London. So, but after World War I, something extraordinary happens in keeping with the complete rebuilding of the city, so the infrastructural rebuilding, the embracing of more progressive censorship laws, and the overturning of the old order, the questioning of all of the values and attitudes of the pre-war period, the pre-World War I period. Berlin literally catapults into the center of cultural life in Europe. Anyone who's on the make, who wants to create art, who wants to be a great artist, they're heading for Berlin in 1925. And it is here that this myth that we spoke about at the beginning of the cultural explosion of the Golden Twenties starts to happen. And remember, just to remind you again, that as we spoke about earlier in the lecture, part of the myths attached to this period, the possibly exaggerated claims made about this period relate to the fact that there were just so many talented and brilliant people progressive, experimental artists living here, working here, and that many of these escaped, as I said before, were forced to be exiles, forced to flee Nazi Germany, as Nazi Germany seemed to come closer and closer as a reality, and took with them the flames of the story and spread it far and wide. So we could argue that the whole nature of the Golden Twenties was a little bit exaggerated, but it was significant enough to have produced some of the most important and innovative art of the 20th century. The other aspect of life in Berlin, and this is very important, it goes hand in glove. This is why I also mentioned the importance of the Babylon Berlin, this successful German series. It wasn't just about cultural experimentation and it wasn't just about artistic experimentation. It was also a fervid new world in the context of the moral collapse of the Western world, or the moral collapse that had been experienced as a result of World War I. And this relates to one of the most important ideas or aspects of the reputation of Weimar Berlin in the 1920s was of decadence. Okay, and for example, Christopher Isherwood, the writer who captured this so well for the Anglophone world, for the English-speaking world, in his book Goodbye to Berlin, he comes to Berlin because he can have homosexual relationships in Berlin without a threat. It's completely possible to explore his sexuality in Berlin without the threat of the establishment coming down on him, as would have happened in England. So there was incredible openness, sexual permissiveness. You had, by today's standards, we no longer use the language of drag, but to use the term that would have been used back then in the 1920s, there were huge parties where people dressed up as members of the opposite sex. Everything went, gay relationships, prostitution, all of these things that would have been crushed under imperial rule became an accepted part of daily life in Berlin. And this was incredibly, for artists who were gay, for example, it was such a liberation to be able to live in a city where they could practice their art, and also where they could be, they could explore their sexuality, whatever their sexuality happened to be. This was an incredibly powerful conduit to creative expression as well. And the prostitution, this is a darker thing, and I think it's important. Somebody like Christopher Isherwood coming to Berlin and enjoying the freedom to be a gay man is a very positive thing, but of course many people in Berlin, the reason there was such a wellspring of prostitution was often because people were still very, very poor. So the prostitution, the permissiveness, was also linked to the continued economic hardships faced by ordinary Germans. But what it all created together, what it accumulated in, was a fast, wild, free, intense milieu where people were seeing just how far they could push the boundaries of society. One of the points that characterized the artistic and cultural milieu of Weimar Berlin has been beautifully stated by the historian Peter Gay, who refers to Weimar as a place where the outsider became the insider. And this is a really important point. In Weimar Berlin, it's very, as a historian, it would be very nice if we could easily compartmentalize, if one could easily compartmentalize periods and say it begins here and begins there. But of course, many of the artists who flourished in the Weimar scene were artists and writers who'd already been working in the imperial era. We spoke earlier about Rosa Luxemburg, the fact that she traveled to Berlin to join a kind of international gathering of people in Berlin before World War I who were interested in the potential of the German industrial working class to achieve world revolution. So in a sense, these artists don't pop out of nowhere, but with this important point of the relaxing of censorship, it is suddenly the case that the outsiders of Imperial Germany become the insiders. And in fact the cultural elite of Weimar Berlin. So essentially, the avant-garde is now the cultural elite. And this is aided and given color by the mass arrival of Russian artists and thinkers who flood to Berlin, some of them as genuine provocateurs, others as simply passionate fellow travelers who believe in exporting the Russian Revolution to the world, who arrive in Berlin, and the idea behind the art of this time is the breaking down of the boundaries of what has been normal before. So in keeping with the atmosphere and the time. And Peter Gay makes the very important point that the feminists, the writers, the Jewish people, the homosexuals, people who were excluded or limited in their potential to move under imperial rule, suddenly flower and come to the center of culture in Berlin. And it is impossible in the remaining time we have in this lecture for me to unpack all of the aspects of the cultural artifacts and products that came from this period. But we can point to an important theme, and this theme was definitely one of a kind of revolutionary fervor. For example, somebody like the playwright Brecht was consciously attempting to write to write plays that critiqued the bourgeois world, the world of capitalism, that proposed that the only way forward was to reform society along the lines of a communist revolution that fundamentally reconstructed society and reconfigured everything from the ground up. So Brecht's theatre was very, very clearly aimed at provoking, at exposing the shame of capitalist society, and of encouraging and pointing towards a revolutionary future where the poor would throw off the shackles of capitalism and attain a communist utopia. And this was a theme that was, in every sense, living in the different art forms that were being experimented on. Another practical innovation, if we look beyond the world of art, is Bauhaus, founded by Walter Gropius, who embodied, who is regarded as one of the great modernist architects, and who had practical solutions for the problem of housing in cities like Berlin. For him, the task of the architect is also to find a reasonable solution to housing problems for the workers. And this communal living, well-designed apartment blocks with adequate hygiene resulted in actual practical buildings that were built in Berlin in the 1920s and that significantly improved the long-term life expectancy and the levels of disease and poverty amongst the working poor. So we're not just talking about artists who were sitting in cafes, taking cocaine and experimenting and thinking about a brave new world. We're also talking about architects, thinkers who wanted to have practical import into the world, who wanted to affect for the better the daily life of the workers, of ordinary people. And so it is not just a time of sort of florid experimentation in an abstract sense. There is real thinking about how the world could be a better place. And this is one of the better aspects, one of the best things, in fact. Let us risk an exaggeration. This is one of the best things about this Weimar period. You can still see some of the Bauhaus buildings here in Berlin. And there was a great improvement in levels of disease and how many people were dying of disease at young ages in this period as the Weimar government oversaw the modernization of accommodation. And remember when we spoke earlier about the horrifying rental barracks and the very terrible living conditions of workers in Berlin in the second half of the 19th century. So a figure like Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, some of his disciples, these are significant theoreticians and thinkers who are really trying to make, for better or for worse, the world into a new and better form. We are now coming to the end of this lecture, and of course I am again, I think, doing a disservice to the complexity of this historical moment. Which moment am I referring to? I'm referring to the demise of the Weimar period. The thing though is that this is a story we all know the ending to. We all know what happened next. In 1933 the Nazis came to power in Germany, and they marched Germany into the most catastrophic, and I'm using that word again on purpose, catastrophic war in human history, and enacted genocide on a scale that has never before been encountered. As far as we know, according to the records we have, there was never a genocide like the genocide carried out by the Nazis. So we know the tragic end to this story. The end of German democracy in 1933 was the beginning of the Nazi regime. Having said that though, I said to you from the beginning, and here I must plug a little bit for the course, because I think that with an hour and a bit of a lecture you can't really go deeply into some of the important issues that underwrote the demise of Weimar. And so I have to just run through it very quickly now, but I would be able to, and I do in the course, take the time to explore some of these things at greater length, which I think is very important. So, what was going on behind the scenes? I've already referenced it in terms of prostitution. I've said to you the permissive sexual environment of Weimar, in Berlin in particular, let's keep it in Berlin, was also a sign of desperation. People were essentially prostituting themselves because they needed money. And this is the point. Though the 1920s saw a kind of temporary economic rehabilitation, mainly due to the injecting of American loans into Germany, it was a kind of temporary interlude. There was still enormous poverty. The people who'd been damaged by World War I were still damaged. The society that had been undone by World War I and the revolutions following World War I was still suffering. And in a way, the kind of hedonistic, intense milieu of Berlin and Weimar Berlin and the golden 20s and the art and the movies and the music and the theatre and the painting, it was very far away from ordinary people's reality. And I really must stress this. It has resonance to our time too. That it was very, very far away from ordinary people's reality. That some of the girls who were 16, 17 years old, who were prostituting themselves on the Kurfürstendamm in the 1920s, were doing it not because they were sexually liberated, but because they had to feed their families or aid in feeding their families. So there is a dark side to Weimar, and it's something which we often miss when we focus on the artistic milieu and the exciting culture that came out of Weimar. Children who were born in 1916, 17, 18 were born into the chaotic conditions that we have discussed at length when we looked at Rosa Luxemburg and revolutionary Berlin. And this lost generation did not accept that they had lost the war. And this is really something that requires further examination, but the idea simply was Germany had been stabbed in the back, Germany had been betrayed, and to that degree, because it was the Weimar government that signed the Treaty of Versailles, that essentially agreed to the awful war reparations and the moral responsibility for World War I. This delegitimated Weimar in the eyes of very many young people who were not in the center of the cultural elite in Berlin, but were struggling to live their lives on the periphery. And this brings us to 1929. We will never know, if one looks at it counterfactually, we will never know what might have happened if the Great Depression hadn't happened, if the crash in 1929 had not happened, if Germany and Weimar had steadily and incrementally improved its economic fortunes. We'll never know what might have happened then. But what did happen was the catastrophic collapse that was caused by Wall Street in 1929, which followed shortly with America recalling its loans. And when that happened, Germany was impoverished again. So once again, people who had just fought their way out of that original devastation of World War I were suddenly rendered helpless again, and the economy collapsed again. And it is at this point that Nazi Germany, that the Nazis' message starts to gain more and more traction. I can only throw this out as a kind of lure to hope that you'll come back for more, because this is really something that I can't go into at great length, given our time limitations. But in a sense, part of the accidental catastrophe, again that word, the accidental catastrophe of Weimar, was that it didn't always reflect the struggles of ordinary people. And that after another economic convulsion and collapse, the ideas of Nazism very, very quickly gained real impetus and traction. And one of the things the Nazis did was indict relentlessly everything about Weimar. It indicted its Jewish politicians, it indicted the artists, the internationals, the rootless cosmopolitans, who supposedly were so morally corrosive that they stood by the collapse of Germany's social order. They relentlessly pushed the idea that Weimar was a betrayal, and not just any betrayal, but a Jewish betrayal, a Bolshevik betrayal. And for people who had now suffered their second economic collapse, who were facing the same kind of destruction in their personal daily lives as they'd experienced just more than a decade earlier, the Nazis' message meant a great deal. Many historians ask the question, would the Nazis have come to power? They'd remained fairly marginal in German politics until the crash of 1929. Would the incremental achievements of Weimar, its attempts, for all its weaknesses, and remember, let me just say this again, one of the worst weaknesses of Weimar was the government's relentless relying upon the brutish muscle of right-wing militias and the army and the police force to crush communist dissent. So it's not as if I'm arguing in this course that Weimar was some kind of paradise or morally superior realm. There were very serious problems with the way in which that government ran Germany. But had its incremental modernism, had its modernity, had its attempt to improve the lot of ordinary Germans, had there been time for it to develop without the great crash of 1929? We won't know. We'll never know if perhaps the catastrophe, there's that word again, but perhaps the catastrophe of Nazism would never have caught on. Everything about Weimar is like Berlin, really. A tragic story, a hopeful story, a story unlike anything else you'll ever hear. And that's really Berlin and its history and what it means to the world today. And I'm going to stop now before I start rambling on in a form quite inappropriate for an academic lecture. I genuinely hope that this has been a kind of introduction to something that we could explore at greater length if you do the course with FUBiS, and I hope you enjoyed it. There's a chance for you to go through the material again and to look at all the links. I haven't put actual hyperlinks in, but you can actually just see names, titles, and you can follow the story yourself. And hopefully I will have the chance to teach this to you in person soon. Thank you.